Thank you, and welcome everyone to the second College Football Playoff Selection Committee teleconference for the 2021 season. Joining us again tonight is Bill Hancock, the Executive Director of the College Football Playoff, along with Gary Barta, our College Football Playoff Selection Committee Chair. As a reminder to everyone on the line, we are transcribing tonight's call and will post the transcripts on collegepressbox.com shortly after the conclusion of this teleconference. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Gary for opening comments.
Thanks, Brett. Good evening, everybody. Well, we've concluded our second week of work as a selection committee, and by now you know we ranked Georgia number 1, Alabama 2, Oregon 3, and Ohio State 4. Georgia just continues to dominate in all areas, both sides of the ball, so the committee has them at number 1. With Alabama, despite their close loss to LSU, the committee still views them as a strong, well-balanced team. They're still they're in offense and defense statistically are still in the top 5 in several categories, and they have 5 wins against teams better than 500 record. Oregon coming off of a win in Washington, some nasty weather, but they're ranked 3rd. They have a win against a top 10 team as well, of course. And then Michigan State's loss allowed Oregon to move up 1 slot. Ohio State had its win on the road against Nebraska. They're ranked number 4. Committee has them, continues to be impressed with them, particularly offensively. It's worth noting that teams ranked 2 through 6 all won, but the committee just didn't see a separation, anybody rise, to a logjam that I referred to last week is still in place. Also of note, in the top 25, 8 of the teams that we had ranked in the top 25 lost this past weekend. So because of that, there was a lot of up and down movement throughout the rankings. As I've mentioned before, in other words, it's November and it's college football, so a lot of great conference matchups happening every week, including the week ahead. So I just, again, want to thank all of our committee for all their hard work. Requires a lot of time. They're watching a lot of games throughout the week, so just grateful to that group. A note that Rod West was not able to participate, one of the committee members this week. He will be back and rejoin the group next week. So with that, Brett, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
And at this time, if you would like to ask any questions, just press star 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. And your first question comes from Bill Rabinowitz from the Columbus Dispatch. Your line is open.
Yes, Gary, could you kind of talk a little bit more in detail about the decision between from 2 to 7, I guess? Obviously, none of those teams won impressively last week. Is that, as you said, is that why nobody really made that jump?
Yeah, I called it a log jam. You know, when you look at 2 through 6, the committee goes through each team and talks about, if anything changed from last week, their strengths, their weaknesses. As you mentioned, they all won, but nobody separated themselves in that group. Nobody, reached out and tried to push themselves ahead. So that's how it ended up 2 through 6. And then I think your question has to do with Michigan State. Were you asking how they ended up at 7, or was that number?
I am curious in terms of the head-to-head thing, and I know obviously nothing happens in a vacuum, but Oregon beat Ohio State. They're ahead of Ohio State. Michigan State beat Michigan, but they're behind Michigan. Can you explain that?
Well, the explanation that I'll give in general first is, head-to-head certainly is one of the criteria we look at. Wins, losses. We look at strength of schedule. We look at, common opponents, et cetera. And I think that there's several criteria. And then there's 13 members who are watching every game and evaluating. The Michigan State discussion really started last week, and I would just kind of summarize that the committee went back and forth, and that really the consensus was that Michigan probably is a more complete team, statistically, offensively, defensively. They're ranked higher than Michigan State in just about every category. That being said, the committee gave great credence to the Michigan State win head-to-head against Michigan. So that discussion went back and forth last week. This week, the same discussion goes on. What's changed? Michigan won and Michigan State lost. And so for this week, we slotted Michigan State at 7th. As we come back next week, we'll, each of those again, and we'll have another data point to look at.
Thank you.
And your next question comes from Barry Trammell from the Oklahoman. Your line is open.
Yeah, Gary, Oklahoma is lower than the typical unbeaten team this late in the season, and the reasons are apparent, but I was curious whether it's just the lack of strength of schedule, the repeated close games, or the solitary game against Kansas when they were clearly just, something was up. Which of those three you think is the most detrimental to Oklahoma's cause at this point?
I don't know that I'd pick one. I agree. To point out one thing you said, it wasn't just the game against KU. If you look at, they are 9-0, and that's why they're ranked 8th in the country and not somewhere else. But they don't have any signature wins. Their best wins are against Texas Tech. I mentioned last week the committee noted, as probably anybody who's been watching Oklahoma, that the quarterback change to Caleb Williams has changed that team, and so they were off this past week, but just looking to see if that continues, because I do think that made a difference. The committee thinks that made a difference, but there just hasn't been a signature win yet. So if you compare them to Michigan State, for example, Michigan State beat Michigan. If you look at Notre Dame, they beat Wisconsin, they've beaten Purdue, so they're sandwiched in between there. But there's a lot of football to be played. Oklahoma's 9-0, and we'll see starting this weekend.
And your next question comes from Aaron McMahon from MLive Media Group. Your line is open.
Hey, Gary. Earlier, with regards to the Michigan State discussion, you said the committee felt that Michigan was probably the more complete team, and I'm wondering how the game between those two schools went into that decision. The game a couple weeks ago between the two.
Well, in the end, while there was a lot of discussion about watching the teams play, looking at the statistics, looking at where the way that Michigan's ranked statistically in offense and defense, all of that was part of the discussion. But at the end of the day, last week Michigan State beat Michigan, and the committee felt that meant they should be ranked ahead of Michigan. This past week, the same discussions occurred, and it went back to the feeling or the sense of the group in watching the games, watching the teams play, that Michigan just looks to have a more complete team on both sides of the ball. Still giving credit for Michigan State for winning head-to-head, but Michigan won this past week, Michigan State lost, and so for this week, the committee put Michigan at 6, Michigan State at 7. And I'm guessing that debate will continue depending on how both those teams do going forward.
And your next question comes from Nathan Baird from Cleveland.com. Your line is open.
Hi, Gary. Thanks for doing this. Kind of following up on this discussion about the performances overcoming head-to-head results, can you provide some transparency to the performance metrics or the better play on both sides of the ball that have Oregon still ahead of Ohio State at this point of the season?
Well, the back and forth, looking at the win that Oregon has, the Ohio State win. They've also they beat Fresno. They won at UCLA. The play of their quarterback. They won at Washington in a really bad weather situation. You look at Ohio State. They have nice wins at Minnesota and Penn State. They beat Maryland. They're playing really well offensively. Nebraska's a tough place to win at. But as the committee stopped and had that conversation back and forth, both teams won this weekend, and neither team separated themselves. So last week, the difference maker for the committee was the Oregon win at Ohio State, and I would just suggest that since nothing really changed in the committee's eyes since last week, both teams won, both teams were on the road. Oregon maybe shined a little bit more, but at the end of the day, Oregon ahead of Ohio State this week, and that doesn't mean that criteria would be the same the rest of the year. It depends on now. Next week we'll do it all over again.
And your next question comes from Eric Hansen from South Bend Tribune. Your line is open.
Hi, Gary. My question has to do with Notre Dame. How much, obviously, Oklahoma's between Notre Dame and the Michigan schools. How close is Notre Dame to the Michigan schools? And maybe if they showed, improvement as an overall team to their statistical profile, will that help them down the stretch, even with a less than challenging schedule?
Well, the starting point is when we've had these conversations, I mentioned having the conversation between Michigan and Michigan State. What generally happens, we don't have that just between those two. And I know we had conversations that grouped, everything from Michigan down to Oklahoma State, and we compared all of those teams against each other with all the statistics we look at, and we'd break it down. And so the long answer to your question, and now I'll try to shorten it up, is Notre Dame's right there with those groups. They're 8-1. They have nice wins at Wisconsin and Purdue. To your last point, keep winning, obviously, for any of these teams. And maybe the strength of schedule provides some more opportunities moving forward for some of those other schools. But, like anything else, if Notre Dame just keeps winning, we'll have to see what happens with Oklahoma, Michigan State, Michigan that are above them.
Thank you.
And your next question comes from Doug Lesmerises from Cleveland.com. Your line is open.
Hi, Gary. You've referenced the discussion that took place last week between Michigan and Michigan State. Was there some discussion in the room last week, or people in the room who thought that Michigan should be ranked ahead of Michigan State last week, immediately after Michigan State beat Michigan on the field?
I'm not willing to go there. What I was saying is there was and continues to be discussion that Michigan, in the opinion of the committee, is a more complete team. That's the dialogue that last week it continued this week. But I don't remember every part of the discussion last week, other than to say that Michigan State got the respect and the nod for the win head-to-head over Michigan.
And your next question comes from Guerin Emig from Tulsa World. Your line is open.
Yeah, Gary, wondering if you could give me the committee's just general assessment of Oklahoma State to this point, please.
Very impressive. And I think, like most people across the country have watched Oklahoma State over the years, the fact that their defense is so dominating this year is noted. And I know just this past week, I think they had 7 sacks, and they really dominated that game at West Virginia, which is a tough place to play. They've beaten Baylor, and the only loss is at Iowa State, which is a place to play. So the committee thinks very highly of Oklahoma State. They're 10th, and I haven't looked ahead to see who they play next week, but we'll continue to watch them and very impressed with them.
And your next question comes from the line of Heather Dinich from ESPN. Your line is open.
Gary, I was just wondering how much over the past 2 weeks you guys have talked about Penn State, if at all, because they have some wins over some of your top 25 teams, but they haven't been ranked. Just why, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I would say this week we talked about them more than a week ago, and we talked about them a week ago. So they're in the conversation. The committee sees them as a very good team, a tough team to play. When we talk about somebody beating Penn State, it's seen as a good win. Like most of the times when we have these conversations, when you compare them, I'll look at number 25 this week is Arkansas. They have a win over Texas A&M and they beat Mississippi State. So are they in the discussion? Yeah. They haven't made it to the top 25, but very good football team.
And your next question comes from Dan Hope from 11 Warriors. Your line is open.
My question was asked. I'm good. Thanks, Bill.
And your last question comes from the line of Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic. Your line is open.
Yeah, hi, Gary. I was just curious if head-to-head should be applied consistently if you're comparing multiple sets of, Team A versus Team B and C versus D in the same set of rankings. Does the committee believe that it should be viewed the same when you're comparing different teams?
Well, what the committee does is we take every piece of information we have available, and so we look at the record. I know I'm being a little redundant. We look at who, common. We look at head-to-head. We look at strength of defense versus offense. 13 people watch the games. We're watching the games all week long, and so that's the subjectivity part of it. But by design, there's subjectivity by people who are watching all the games. So it's considered in every case. That doesn't mean in every case head is going to put one team over another. As you know, this is my third year on the committee, and I can tell you that I know numerous examples where head-to-head is overcome by other things. And in this ranking alone this week, it's no different. There are some head-to-heads where, one team is still, there's some where they're not, and that could still change as the year goes on.
So just to double check, so the committee's fine if head-to-head is a deciding factor for two teams but not the others in the same ranking?
I don't know. I'm sorry if I don't quite understand your question.
I'm just saying the committee is fine with if head-to-head is a determining factor for a couple of teams in their rankings, but is decided not to be the deciding factor or the separator for other teams in the same set of rankings.
It's considered in all ranking discussions. It's not the sole data point that we use. For example, if someone has one loss, we don't automatically say that the undefeated team is ahead of the one loss. Same thing with head-to-head. It's considered, it's looked at, but it isn't the only piece of information that we make the final decision upon.
Okay, thank you.
And that concludes our question and answer session. I will turn the call over back to Brett Daniels.
Yes, thank you, Gary, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. This concludes this week's selection committee call. Just as a reminder, we are transcribing the call, and we'll post that transcript at collegepressbox.com shortly. Thank you, and have a good evening, everyone.